Welcome to the Jason de Sousa Show. Join us as we explore the evolving urban landscape, uncovering the trends, stories, and innovations shaping our cities. Thanks for watching and enjoy today's episode.
Andrew Lowe, welcome to the Jason de Sousa Show.
Hi Jason, great to be here.
And congratulations on your new book, We Should Be So Lucky, Why the Australian Way Works.
Thank you.
Which I think is just fantastic you've written this book. It's a really important time, I think, for Australia to hear more about why its success is what it is and how we can build upon it. So I know how much you love public policy, despite the fact you come from an investment banking background. But this is a great period of time, I think, for Australia, and a great book. But I want to start, before I start asking you questions, by reading an excerpt of the book, because I think it'll just set us up for our conversation. So here we go. Imagine a country whose people enjoy the highest median wealth in the world and also a life expectancy 2 years longer than Britain and 5 years more than the United States. Imagine that same country goes for almost 30 years without a recession and then bounces back from COVID with its rare AAA credit rating reaffirmed and a national budget in surplus. A country where average incomes, GDP per head, are 30% higher than the UK, and median wealth is almost twice as high, and the world's top-ranked healthcare system is a mix of effectiveness and equity, one of the two best places to be born in the lottery of life. A country that is a huge beneficiary of the shifting center of gravity of the world towards a region in Asia, but with close ties to Europe, an ever tighter American ally when China is reasserting its historic primacy in the region, an innovative country with a world-leading quality of life, but where political debate is often negative, bruising, and focused on the trivial. Isn't that true, right? Most Australians respond to the persistent evidence of their remarkable and unusual national health and prosperity by shrugging that Australia is simply lucky. Yeah. Well, you challenge this notion in the book, and I want to know why.
Yeah. No, thanks, Jason. Yeah, no, I think, as you say, we're all very quick to come up with a dozen things that we think are wrong with Australia. But it seemed to me, as I kind of travelled around, as you know, I've spent about half my working life outside of Australia, in Hong Kong, in North America, in London and other places. And it seemed to me the story that doesn't get told is actually the positive story, that for all the things that we would like to tweak and change and where we think government policy might be going in the wrong direction, that if you look at Australia from the outside in a comparative lens against other places, there's actually a lot that we get right. And I thought, well, that's a story that people don't tell.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. And I do wonder sometimes whether we talk ourselves into not doing things by saying, well, you know, we are a resource-rich country, so therefore we can only dig up things out of the ground. In fact, remember a former prime minister once quipping that, you know, people think of us as China's beach and China's quarry and Japan's beach.
Yeah.
He wasn't suggesting we were that. He was just quipping that people thought that.
And I think that's right. And look, you know, let's start with that as an example. You know, I think there is this lazy assumption that says Australia is wealthy because there's iron ore in the Pilbara. But you know, as you know, economists actually generally draw a negative correlation between the resources of a country and its prosperity. Singapore, very prosperous. The Congo, not so much. You know, in general, you know, they talk about the paradox of plenty or the resources curse, that more often than not, if you have a lot of resources, you end up pushing the exchange rate up, making everything else uncompetitive. The elites of the country, you know, grab that wealth for themselves. And it's only countries like Australia or maybe Norway, perhaps Canada, where you can have resources and actually make good use of it. And Australia's done it because of a good education system that actually delivers strong engineers and people that can actually do all the technical side of mining, a strong financial system that enables these big long-term and complex projects to be financed, good diplomacy, Australia building those relationships with Japan in the 1950s at a time when that was quite unfashionable, and then subsequently with China. So what we think of as just resources in the ground actually speaks to a much broader aptitude and ability as a country to deal with things. And as you say, the danger with not recognising that is that you either become completely complacent about it, or alternatively you lose the secret sauce because you actually don't realise what the recipe is.
So that's a good segue into me asking then, what is the Australian way as you define it?
So look, I distill a few different aspects to it. One is the unique set of political institutions that we've got. So adopting some of the best features of late 19th century British liberal ideas, but then grafting on top of that compulsory voting, preferential voting, a federal system, which actually tends to drive the political debate towards the centre. So you don't have this phenomenon that you see in many other countries where the way to win an election is get your base as angry as possible to get them to the to the thing. In Australia, you've actually got to aim at the people in the middle, many of whom actually don't spend too much time thinking about politics. It might be a healthy thing for a lot of people. You've actually got to talk to those people. Federation means that things are levelled up in the UK.
Using the British terminology.
The British term in a way that they aren't. So the political institutions, the unique mix that we have of public and private provision around things like healthcare, the way we do pensions, the way we do superannuation, the way we do education. So I think there's a bit of a formula there, which I've sort of suggested might have something to do with our great affinity for sport in Australia. that we understand that there is a role for the umpire, for government to set the rules and make sure that the pitch and the players are in the best form, but also leave it to don't actually get involved in the play. And so that kind of mix of public and private in the way that we think about things, I think, is part of the Australian way as well.
I think that's really an interesting observation, right? So I often argue that the role of government is one that sets the rules and then allows people to play within those rules, and then adjusts those rules according to movements in the market. And I think one of the interesting things, and I think we'll get into this, is that assumes that the government only occupies space that it doesn't crowd out the private sector from doing so, right? You and I have talked about this over many years, right? And I've often wondered whether we have moved beyond that in most Western democracies now. Government is too interventionist.
And I think it's a very timely debate in terms of things like healthcare, where we've got 50% of hospital beds in Australia are privately operated, 55% of people have private health insurance, and actually the combination of a basic level of care for everyone in the community, sort of a bit along the lines of the NHS, but without that centralised monopoly provider, which, as we've seen in the UK, has actually led to actually some really bad results. That constructive tension, the ability for a specialist to work in the public system 4 days a week, but then do some private work that enables them to be paid much more than they would in other markets. That kind of balance is quite important, and I think there's always a danger that if you don't appreciate the balance, then you push too far one way or the other, and you actually end up with worse outcomes.
Is the Australian way more though than just our institutions? Is it a? You mentioned Singapore earlier, so let's look at that as an example. What drove the Singaporean success story was a visionary leader who recognised that their island nation didn't really have any resources, and the only resource it had was its people. And it invested in its people, and it set an economic framework that kind of leveraged the countries around it. Right? I've always felt Australia had a similar type of focus in a way.
I think it's actually interesting, and it surprised me researching this book actually that there were more commonalities between Australia and Singapore in many areas than I would have thought. In the way, because they also have been very good at setting up public policy settings in a sensible way that then allows the power of markets and the private sector to actually do things, and that includes the infrastructure, the openness to trade, the way that the civil service works. So I think there's probably some things we could learn from Singapore on things like education, which I know you think about a lot as well. And there are things that Singapore could learn from us, because I think there was a stage from the 1960s where maybe that much stronger leadership that you mentioned from Lee Kuan Yew and so on was important, but Singapore's arguably now at a stage where being a little bit more pluralistic in the way that Australia works actually may well serve Singapore well for the next part of its journey.
Well, I think that's right, because the visionary leader and his descendants are now out of the picture, right?
Yeah, and I think also, for a country that's going from, as the Lee Kuan Yew story always says, from third world to first, I think was the title of his biography. That's a different challenge in governance from a country like Australia, which is already the highest ranking in terms of median wealth in the world, has these very strong health outcomes and so on, and that doesn't necessarily require a single charismatic leader, and in fact a single charismatic leader can be a very bad thing for a country where actually it's more a case of not making big mistakes and evolving rather than having a revolution.
Well, that's a good segue into looking at some of the things that might well be mistakes or might not, depending on the context. But so you set out your book in different chapters. You've given them pretty clear titles. So I thought for our conversation it would be helpful to kind of go through that. And I'm going to try and play a bit of a counterpoint to some of your arguments through it, and you can tell me if I'm on drugs or not. Okay.
Good.
So I guess the first thing I wanted to ask, I think, with the voice debate recently, with the whole question around citizenship, the whole migration question in Australia, there has been, I think, a question around what it is to be an Australian. And so I think of it as one of a love of country and a set of shared values that people unite around, right? And I think both of us lived in Asia, both of us lived in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, during that period of time, there was a shared set of values around being Hong Kong Chinese. I think that's right, or being from Hong Kong, whether you're expatriate or not. I think that same set of values applies in Australia to being an Australian, despite the fact that we're a young country. Am I right?
Yeah, no. I think that's right. And so what was interesting to me was, as you say, the idea of being an Australian is clearly quite an interesting one, because it's not something that's defined by a particular race or necessarily where people were born, because for 50% of us were either born overseas or at least one of our parents was born overseas. So it is more around a set of values, and we know that even expatriate Australians are very Australian. You meet people everywhere from Hollywood to the City of London to different parts of Asia, and they still have this very strong sense of Australianness. So what are those values? There's a group called the Hofstede Institute that does these almost like national personality studies, and they look at different countries on things like egalitarian to hierarchical, short-term to long-term, whether you're indulgent or restrained, risk-taking or sort of risk-averse or very safety conscious. And there is a clear pattern, which is really interesting, about where Australians sit in that. and you'd be unsurprised, I'm sure, that other than New Zealanders were about the most egalitarian and non-hierarchical culture. On the other hand, you've got this sort of almost a bit of a paradox where Australians are very high on the scale of competitiveness and achievement focus, and actually quite driven, compared to most other countries, but at the same time very safety conscious. We're first places in the world to have compulsory seat belts, pool fencing, helmets on it, and we should talk more about that, because obviously these things can be a two-edged sword. There's some really good things about that, but I'm sure we'll...
You're reminding me of the Bluey episode where the father bandit says to his children, imagine this world where we didn't wear helmets and we didn't do this and we do that. And she goes, it was called the 80s.
Yes. Yeah, and we should come back to that. But to your point, I think those values are important, and I mean, we've actually been a remarkably successful immigrant society. But at the same time, I think you're right to say that people, are increasingly focusing on what do we expect of people that come to Australia in terms of the things that the many areas where we want a lot of diversity, and then the core values of respect for democracy, the rule of law, the way that people relate, as it comes to gender and things like that. Where I think we do need to have higher expectations and maybe be a bit more clear about what we're looking for and what Australian citizenship means.
Oh, I totally agree. As a migrant and a citizen now, I find the discussion on multiculturalism quite interesting, because there's a view that to be multicultural, you can retain your culture and you must observe your culture, but you shouldn't adopt any of the host country's culture because you're of a culture. That's one school of thought. My school of thought is that I came here because I liked the country. I married an Australian. I see a set of values that I want to associate myself with, to become an Australian. That doesn't make my culture any different. I can still respect my Indian heritage. I can still respect my heritage as a Hong Konger. I can love those things and respect those things while still uniting around a core set of values in my host country. That's not a view shared by all, and I just wonder whether we haven't been, as a country, expressive enough of the need to unite around a set of Australian values, because it's not because that's what you should just do, it's because uniting around a set of values brings social cohesion, brings harmony.
Yeah. Look, I think what you've described is certainly the way my family felt when we migrated, and I think to be again optimistic, because this is an optimistic book. I do think the vast majority of Australians feel like that, and the vast majority of immigrants feel like that. Now, we've clearly seen some high-profile instances of people that haven't bought into that, but I do think they're still a relatively small minority in the grand scheme of Australia. And we should be alert to that, and we should think about the lessons that implies for the process and how we select from the millions of people that want to come to Australia. We do have the luxury of being able to be quite selective.
To choose who.
And to your point, I think there's probably a growing realization that that it's not wrong to make some of those demands on people that come to Australia, while at the same time recognising how brilliant it is that we get all these different cultures and so on that go into the melting pot of Australia. What an uninteresting country we would be if
absolutely.
If we still only got all our immigrants from where we did in the 1940s.
I mean, that said, no one is demanding that everyone knows what Don Bradman's cricket batting average was,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
But I mean, you know,
no,
that's,
but look, it's a good point, because I think, you know, this sort of discussion can go down those kind of paths.
Exactly, yeah.
Whereas, you know, what we know is that what's important is not really. I mean, yeah, it'd be great if everyone did know what Don Redmond's average is, but that's not what's important. What's important is that people know that we resolve disputes peacefully, and we do them through the institutions, and that we understand what those institutions are, and that we take our responsibilities as citizens seriously. Yeah, that's what's important.
Yeah. And I think, you know, this wasn't where I wanted to go today, but I will go there because we're talking about it, which is, I worry a little bit, you know, about sort of the regulation of this area. We talked a little bit about it. You know, our response to some of the more unpleasant things is, well, we must regulate that. It's hate speech. We will bring in hate speech laws. And of course, I don't like unpleasant things. I don't like people being openly racist or discriminatory against anyone. There's that really delicate line between what is absolutely inappropriate and some of the things we've seen.
And the difference between people expressing views which, as you know, I think I quite like that phrase, that are awful but lawful. You know, versus people actually inciting violence or, you know, engaging in behaviour which is not lawful, and you know, and that's a balance. I think, as you say, that is within the overall context of Australians leaning towards safety and risk management and things. And I actually think in general we've actually managed that balance pretty well, although, you know, I think we both have views on things that have been brought forward that, you know, we might agree with or not agree with, that kind of stress that balance. I think it also applies obviously to the way we think about boards, or the way boards look at risk at the general level of regulation. I did an event associated with this book and one of the leading management consultants was sharing with me some studies that they'd done of regulation, and looking at the amount of the clauses in federal and state government legislation that have the words prohibit or restrict in them.
Right.
And you'll be unsurprised to know that it's in the hundreds of thousands.
Oh, yeah. I can imagine.
And worse still, it's gone up by 50% in the last 10 years. So that gets to the question of, it's great to have a lot of thought to safety and risk management and cutting out things which, you know, like pool fences or so on. Yeah. But if you take that too far, you can actually end up strangling a lot of entrepreneurship. You can end up, not being as innovative and as strong as we actually could be as a country.
That's what terrifies me about our situation, right? Because I agree with all of the sentiments in your book around what makes us a successful country. But I worry we're strangling ourselves. Right? Yeah. And there was that very famous Senate testimony that Kerry Packer gave. I think it was on print media. And Lil, we'll put that in the links in the show notes, because it was a fascinating appearance where he basically says, this idea of Australian parliaments just passing legislation after legislation after legislation is a nonsense. Nobody understands it. You've got to be a lawyer. You know, since I was a boy to now an adult, there must be hundreds of thousands of pages, and I don't think the country is that much better. That was a view expressed in the 1990s by what was a formidable businessman. But I look at that and I worry that that's us. No, the fact that 50% increase in regulation and nobody blinks, that terrifies me.
No. Right? No, look, I think that's absolutely right. And of course, you know, we're seeing in the US the the Doge and the chainsaws and so on. I'd like to think in Australia that we can do it with a scalpel rather than a chainsaw, because
even Donald Trump is talking about scalpels now.
Right. You know, you need to be careful in how you do these things. But I think there is no question that taken too far, and we probably have taken it too far, that does lead to lower productivity. It does lead to, not only a lack of innovation or commercialisation, but it also just makes it a less interesting and dynamic place for our kids to grow up. There's a great quote from Barry Humphries that to live full-time in Australia is like going to a party and dancing only with your mother. And I think there's a danger that, I think that may overstate it, but I think there is a danger that you can also make life quite bland if you try to literally stamp out anything that can possibly go wrong.
Well, it's interesting. So in the book, in the chapter of the book Wealthy, you say the story of Australia's revival in the 1980s and 1900s has been told before, but worth knowing. 1990, sorry, 1890. Yes, that's right. Knowing what was done right underpins a national narrative that can keep success going. And to your point about this regulation thing, I say, well, if you look at our labour regulations, they've regressed probably to pre-1980s levels. I think it's safe to say. And governments have campaigned on that. I think the very high government spending that was incurred during COVID has not reduced. And I was horrified to find out the other day that some 80% of new jobs created between 2022 and now were public sector jobs, not private sector jobs. And arguably, we have taxation rates that are becoming unsustainable for on income tax, and will likely rise as we pay for an increasing level of federal and state spending. So I ask then, are we on the right track? And are you saying in your book that, similar to what we're talking about now, that we need to somehow review and change?
So I think it's really interesting when you look at Australian economic history, and it was interesting in researching it that we have this period from the 1850s to the 1890s, just leading into federation, where Australia becomes the wealthiest country in the world on a sort of per capita basis. You then had, for about the first sort of 3/4 of the 20th century, a slow decline where we went down to about number 14 or 15 in the world. And then through the reforms of the 1980s and the 1990s, you actually see median wealth go up again. And in fact, median wealth goes from being about the same as the US and the UK to actually being about 70% higher than the UK, or almost over double the median wealth of the US. So the US overall averages slightly higher wealth than Australia, but most of it is, a lot of it is concentrated in a very small number of people. So your median person, 50% of people are wealthier, 50% are not wealthier, is actually much better off in Australia than they are in the US. And we can unpack why that might explain some of the differences in the way that politics has played out in both countries. But to your point, all that good work that did in the 80s and 90s, and you had productivity around sort of 2% growing, then it sort of slipped to 1%. Now it's kind of slipped into negative territory, and I just hope it's not going to take us another 3/4 of a century to kind of stop that erosion.
I am a little positive in the sense that I'm starting to hear people talk about it. Right? So I posted something on my LinkedIn page the other day. Productivity has fallen every year since 2007. Productivity growth has fallen every year since 2007, and we've managed to supplement some of our growth with migration. That's great, but per person, we are producing less. That's not a positive trajectory, and I think up till now, governments have kind of gone, whatever, it's fine.
Now the glass half full thing on that is that we haven't made hard decisions on productivity, because life is actually, objectively
pretty
compared
good.
to other parts of the world, pretty good. But as I say, the danger of that is that it leads to a sense of complacency and drift. And I think, as you say, there is a lot of conversation about that. And I think one of the things that I thought this book can hopefully do is just to remind people of what the formula was for Australia? How did we get to that position where we have such a strong quality of life, where we have such a high degree of income and healthcare and so on? And let's not drift for 75 years before we before we start to again make those small improvements that are needed to maintain it.
I just think, though, what has changed recently has been the recognition that the level of social programs that we have decided to put in place are becoming unaffordable, right? So you look at the trajectory of Medicare when it was first brought in, the history of it, it was super expensive. And then over time, it's sort of been brought into sort of a more affordable category. The NDIS, I think, is kind of going through that phase now where it started, nobody would doubt that we should do the NDIS, but do it efficiently.
Yeah, I think on a lot of these things, the aspiration is very laudable. We are a rich country. We can afford to look after people. We can afford to have relatively high levels of wages and so on.
And we want to.
Those are all good things. I think where it becomes a problem is where you either don't think it through, and I think there's certainly an argument that with the NDIS, as with the NBN and various other things like that, there was a program unveiled without enough thought about how do we actually manage this, how do we scale it. As you know, Jason, in projects in the private sector, a lot of the companies that you've been involved in, it's not unusual that if you try to do massively big things, that they go off track. How many companies have had massive redesigns of their computer systems and IT, and I think one of the things that I note about why Australia's been successful is that we've actually been pretty good overall, with some of these exceptions, at sort of doing smaller things, and that's how, as you know, China sort of had that great success period from 1979 onwards, where you had at that time people running the country who were from an engineering background, and they'd try something in a pilot program, see how it works, see what doesn't work, and then they'd scale it up and just allow more things. And I think we need to do more of that. So less of these big, let's redesign the entire world from Canberra. Let's try and change everything day one, and more trying to look at things that work and how we incrementally improve. I think the Japanese have this term kaizen.
Exactly.
Just gradually tweaking things, and that's what works, and that's certainly what's worked for Australia.
I agree. I just wonder whether politics allows it.
Yeah.
So if you look at the creation of some of the programs, the NBN was a big gesture by an opposition that said Australia was falling behind and we needed this infrastructure, and bang, it was going to happen, right? The same went for the introduction of the NDIS, which was a monumental change in public policy, right? And how we did it. Do you think politics allows a try, test, learn, implement model?
Yeah. So I think there's nothing inherent in the way the Australian system works that shouldn't allow that. And I think while we can point the finger at political leadership, to some extent that's sort of absolving us of, as citizens, that if the politics is giving us sugar hits and band-aids instead of real solutions.
Yeah, we're the ones forcing that.
That's because their polling is telling them that that's what people want. And so, I think if you look again at the pre-Federation era, if you look at the 1980s and 1990s, a lot of it came from just people in general talking through these things, building a consensus, the media being intelligent and forensic in the way that they examine policy, the business community advocating, economists, the Productivity Commission, which is a terrific Australian institution. And I think it's that cumulative impact of all of that moves the population to a point where they move the politics to the point. So it's not to say we wouldn't all love to have some more inspiring and great political leaders, but I think we also need to create the space in which politics can move in a constructive direction.
Well, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I think politics should allow a try and test, see. I mean, I don't see any reason why a government couldn't announce a pilot test on something to say, well, this is a policy idea. We're going to bring this idea in. We don't know if it's going to work or not. Yeah. But we're going to try. Yeah. Right. I think the political environment and the sort of media environment has become so fast that an idea today is yesterday's it was yesterday's news story. So therefore we need a new news story.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I also think that for politicians and for governments, there's a danger that you're so busy managing the tactical side 100%. Of it, and you've been in government, that you lose that bigger picture that actually, as I think Keating used to say, in the longer term, actually good policy is good politics. Yes. That if you, over the longer term, if you are not making the country richer and more prosperous and making people's lives better, you will get found out eventually. And so, I think it's just, and I suppose that leads to the argument of, do we have too much sort of careerism in politics? Are there enough people going in who actually want to achieve particular objectives rather than just seeing it as a career where the object is just to keep the balls bouncing for long enough to last for a certain period of time?
Well, I agree. I'll be a little controversial in saying I think since COVID in particular, when government sort of found itself in COVID, right? There was a state premier had no idea that they had sovereign control over their borders until COVID, right? The concept of Queensland shutting its borders to New South Wales, or Victoria advertising in New South Wales, and if you cross the border, you will be arrested. These are Australians, right?
Was it Queensland hospitals for Queenslanders?
I mean, this is correct, right? So we're at that level of time where all of a sudden the bureaucracy became almost omnipotent. You had these chief health officers up there every day saying, this is what you're going to do and you must do this. You in Western Sydney, you will be locked down because of the... So I found that period of time really unsettling for Australia, because I think, going back to your point about safety and regulation, we were the most compliant nation on earth.
And I think that reflected an Australian view of being comfortable with a much greater level of safety consciousness. Now, as I say, I don't think it's wrong to want to look after people.
No, not at all.
But there is as you say, there is a danger that can become so all-consuming that you lose the big picture, and people are not sort of held accountable for the broader outcomes.
And look, hindsight's a beautiful thing, right? So we didn't know what COVID was or what it was going to do, so we should put that out there. But I think it is important that we reflect on that period of time. And look at how we behaved, and look at how our institutions behaved.
And I think it is disappointing, as you say, that there really hasn't been much of that retrospective, just in a clear head, what did we get right and what did we get wrong? Because I think there's an argument, particularly in the first year, there were a bunch of things that we did right, and actually, arguably, there would have been a lot more people would have died if not for that. But that then dragged on for a second year in circumstances where actually a lot of what was done was unjustified and was taking things too far. So I think you can look at that in a clear-headed way. But as you say, there probably hasn't been that level of accountability.
The observation I'd make now, as a consequence of government really rising in its power and scope of authority and intervention, I think, into the market, is that now there's a greater divide now between the government and the private sector than there was before. So I think there's a real concern that sort of government just does what it does and the private sector does what it does, and occasionally there's an interface. And that, to me, is an anathema to the Australian way. Because as you say in your book, what is the brilliance of this country? It's that balance between the ability of the public sector to provide social services and supplement it with the capacity and innovation of the private sector.
Yeah.
And I look at a lot of examples, particularly, the industry I work in is, like you, in infrastructure and property and real estate generally and provision of social services. The brilliance of the Australian way has been the ability to balance those two things. Provide public sector services where it's best for the public sector to do it, and allow the private sector to provide some level of service provision where it's in the best interests of the of the taxpayer to do that.
And to set the parameters, and I'll give you two examples on that. What one is around approvals, as you say, for infrastructure, for housing, for so on. It is entirely appropriate that the public sector looks at the national interest and people in giving approvals. What's not appropriate is that it takes 3 or 4 years for these things to happen, and as a result, housing costs a lot more than it does. The younger people are being locked out of housing. We're not getting renewables coming on stream quickly enough to make up for how quickly we're shutting down a lot of fossil fuels. So in that you'd say that balance has got out of kilter. I think there's an issue we need to be careful of with something like superannuation, which has been a really great success for Australia. But one of the reasons that it's been a success is that you've had the government mandate a certain level of contribution, provide a structure for portability of people's accounts, and some transparency around the results, but you've actually let the market and people's individual decision determine the way that the money's been invested and what it's invested in. And people can choose an industry fund, which is effectively a mutual, or they can do a for-profit, or depending on their circumstances, they can self-manage their super. And I think that combination of allowing contestability, individual choice, the market to work, together with a framework, has worked really well. You're now starting to see government be a little bit tempted to say, well, actually, I want you to invest in this and not that, and that sort of thing. And as we know, that's very dangerous.
Well, and that's right. I think that, to me, that's one of the greatest concerns about this new period of interventionist government. Where you have senior officials and you have senior politicians come in and say, I really think our policies on these issues are they're important for Australia. They're critical for Australia. I'm going to direct you, superannuation sector, to invest in these things,
in X rather than Y.
And we saw that with social housing, right? Where the government said, we have this housing affordability problem. Yes, tick. We need more social housing. Tick. Industry super funds, which all have a large union involvement and are very integrated with government in some way or the other. We want you to invest in these things. Please sign this MOU that says you're going to do that. And of course, they haven't done that because the big untold secret, I suppose, of social and affordable housing is that it isn't commercial. It is subsidised in some way by government. So unless you make a return,
and that's fine. I mean, if government wants to create more housing and is happy to do it in a transparent way from its own balance sheet, that's a good thing. But as you say, to do it in an opaque way where you're trying to get someone who's ostensibly commercial to do uncommercial things, that clearly doesn't work.
And that's the danger. And I think discussions like this actually put it on the table and say, well, look, the private sector really wants to invest in stuff. Great, we love investing in stuff. Governments like the private sector investing in stuff, which is great. But the outcome is what you need to focus on. What is in the best interest of the taxpayer?
And we see it in industry policy too, Jason. So there are some ways of doing industry policy which work, like let's work out what skills we're going to need and make sure that we are training people or bringing people in through skilled migration programs to hit those skills. Let's create clusters that allow those externalities of universities and private sector. There are even things like R&D credits where we've basically said we want more research and development, so we're going to provide the ability to sort of push some money into those things. Those are all very legitimate. Unfortunately, what we're seeing now is a return to what we thought had been stamped out, which is actually giving individual grants to individual companies. And everything in history tells you that governments can't pick winners, and losers are very good at picking governments.
I love that phrase.
As the saying
I
goes.
like it. Well, you look back at the Victorian Economic Development Corporation and all that sort of stuff, right?
Yeah. Now, we're not the only country that's making those mistakes, but for a country that has thrived through being open, transparent, trading, we've got a lot to lose if we start to let that develop, and then all the sort of cronyism and things that comes along with it.
What do you make of the argument that we have never really been able to value add to the blessing or the gift of our resources? Like we don't really elaborately transform anything that we do. We don't do anything with uranium, we don't do anything with coal, we don't do anything with iron ore, we just dig it out and ship it out.
Yeah. So look, I think the important thing with that is to properly analyse why we're not doing it, because I think we would all like to see more value adding going on. But the reason it doesn't happen, is that a lot of that processing of things like lithium or aluminum and so on is very energy intensive, and to do it competitively, you need to have low wages and low environmental standards. We've taken a view as a country that we don't want to have low wages and low environmental standards, and that says that there are certain things that you're not going to be able to do competitively. And so I think we need to think about that the right way and not think, we're going to have very high wages, more inflexible labour policies. We're going to be very strict on environmental stuff, but then by kind of throwing a subsidy at company X and Y, we'll sort of make up for that, but not really, and so we'll take resources away from somewhere else. I mean, that it's hard to see how that ends well, and so I'd be thinking more.
I think there's a steelworks in Whyalla that's suffering from this.
We've seen the stats where we're spending $2 million or something per job created or saved and so on, and many of those people actually would be very capable of going to high paid jobs in other industries.
You'd be better off giving them.
If you're a good engineer or chemical engineer, as we know, there's plenty of places that would love to have you. So I think we do need to be careful about that, Jason. As I say, it's a very tempting thing to do, and where there are opportunities to add value in a competitive and sustainable way, we should do it. But if it makes sense for us to do a certain part of the process and then to work with Indonesia or Malaysia or other countries on certain aspects of the value chain, that's not a bad thing either.
I totally agree.
That's not a bad thing either.
There's this geopolitical analyst, Peter Zion, who's pretty good on some of this stuff. And he talks about the friends and family plan in sort of, a relationship between countries. I look at that and I go, we are a middle power in the Pacific, where large countries like PNG are on our doorstep. We should be looking at industry policy that looks to bring them in as well.
That looks at
that looks at a more holistic Pacific thing. That looks at, and we have nibbled around that in the past, but it hasn't really sort of come to pass. And I think maybe that time is now.
And I think you've got to separate the national resilience piece, which says, let's make sure that we have enough fuel, that we have pharmaceuticals, that we have those sorts of things, so that we're resilient in a crisis. You've got to separate that from these kind of issues of what would we in an ideal world like to be doing, because you're never going to be able to do everything. You're never going to invent. One of the things that I sort of said in the book is Australia's 0.3% of the world's population. So even if we're 10 times as good as everyone else at inventing things, 97% of things are still going to be invented somewhere else. And so our comparative advantage and what's made Australia prosperous is that we have this million-odd Australians in different parts of the world picking up technology, skills, bringing things back. We have these skilled migrants that are coming in and bringing the best of the world to us. We're open to trade. And we should lean into that.
I love that you chair Advance, for Australians. I think that's just fantastic. I think that's such a wonderful thing that you do, and it sort of celebrates Australians overseas, which I think is fantastic. A lot to get through because it's a dense book. It's a great book. I'm already being told we have time, so a couple of things. So I want to go back to education.
Yep.
And then we'll do a bit on energy, and we'll do a bit on a few other things. And Lily will tell me we've gone too long, but that's fine. She can yell at me later. Education.
Yeah.
You and I have spoken about it before. Australia has one of the great public egalitarian education systems, a good private education system, a good university network. But it's safe to say our standards are not what they should be. I had Rob Stokes on the show, former education minister. We sort of went around on this a little bit. What do we need to do to make our universities ready for the next generation of the economy?
Well, there's universities, and then we should talk about K to 12 as well.
There's K to 12 as well.
Because arguably the issues are even more.
Well, why don't we start at K to 12? Let's start at K to 12, and then we'll go to you.
Yeah, so if you look at it, so one of the things, again, in researching the book that I found very interesting was that Australia was one of the first countries to introduce universal education, and actually through the early 20th century, right into the second half of the 20th century, it's arguable that the standard of education that someone was getting in a sort of standard school in the suburbs was as good or better than anywhere in the world. So it was a real strength of ours. Unfortunately, in the 1970s and 80s, you start to see a shift towards, largely influenced by American campuses and so on, to getting away from the sort of rigor of teaching literacy and numeracy towards very sort of faddish kind of ideas of education. You've seen just the way classrooms are run has deteriorated. Unfortunately, I think in the OECD ratings, Australia now has the 5th worst classroom discipline kind of setup. And so what you've seen, and this is very interesting because if you look at the last sort of 15 years or so, in almost every measure of the UK versus Australia in various different elements of civil society, Australia has outperformed. The one difference is education. So over the same period, the UK halved the amount of money going into education, and their PISA scores went up a long way. Australia put twice as much money into education. Our PISA scores are going down.
The UK introduced charter schools.
And that tells you, it's about all of those reforms that Gove and Nick Gibb put through. But they really come down to teacher training, as you say, more competitiveness with the different types of models of schooling that were available. So it's fixable, and there are some positive signs that Jason Clare has tried to negotiate some of these things with state departments and so on, but we've still got work to do to really get our K to 12 schooling back on track.
The greatest loss to Australia was when Prime Minister Gillard, when she was Education Minister, had a whole series of reforms that would have substantially improved
Yep.
our education system in Australia.
Yep.
And unfortunately, she
Yeah.
didn't get the time to do it because
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
and then of course she became PM, and then it was too difficult to do anything
Yeah.
when she was Prime
Yeah,
Minister.
No. So,
But what a shame.
So I think education, really something that's pretty fundamental because it does underpin our ability to be successful.
And again, I think the
and
conversation
for individuals to have a meaningful life.
Oh,
I mean,
100%,
if you haven't got basic skills in maths, not only are you not going to be able to do AI or things like that, you're just not going to be able to run your own family budget and make sensible judgments as a citizen.
Rob Stokes was basically saying the basic building blocks of that are in primary school. And if you don't get it right in primary school, it hurts you.
I think that's right. And so, as you say, while there are things that we could nominate that we want to fix in primary school, secondary school, and in tertiary education, I think the primary school is the most important to get right.
Correct.
And
I
then,
agree
and
entirely.
then and then obviously let's make sure that we then have the highest standards in the other forms of education. As well.
And my observation of our public system generally is it's very good, but the schools themselves need to be freer to do what they want. Like, it's interesting, the feedback I get speaking to some of the teachers in the public school my children were at were they would always talk about the department.
Yeah.
The department says, the department mandates, the department requires, the department, and you're sort of like, well, the department's not here. The department has no role.
No, I think there's no doubt greater power for principals to be able to hire, fire, remunerate differentially, all that sort of thing would be positive. Better teacher training to enable teachers to manage classrooms better, have maybe a bit less of kind of the theory and a bit more of the practicality of teaching. I think all of those things would make a significant difference.
And universities?
Yeah, well, universities have been a great success story overall for Australia. We have a lot of very high quality and very well rated universities. I think there's certainly an argument that there's too much focus on producing academic papers and kind of managing for commercial and bureaucratic outcomes. And again, as you say, you hear stats like half the people employed in universities are in administrative roles. I mean that just doesn't make sense, and I think gets to that creeping envelope of regulation and administration that is always in danger of being there if there's not a countervailing force against it.
I do think on universities, and these are rapid fire questions, I guess, but we can. Well, maybe we'll have to come back and do more, Andrew. But I think the thing I look at speaking to several university former vice chancellors is, I think they need to pivot a bit, right, towards a lot deeper relationships with industry than they have had in the past. Because now, just being a graduate isn't quite enough anymore. It's sort of, you've got to have...
Better commercialisation is undoubtedly the right thing. And then I think the other thing that I think people are increasingly recognising is that the reforms of trying to make everyone do the same thing as universities hasn't worked, and we need to have some universities that are much more focused on research in particular areas, and not sort of have this every child must have a toy kind of approach to how we allocate funding in universities.
So let me quickly turn then to energy, because I think this is one of the ones where perhaps the greatest risk to us is. So we are on a path to the transition at the moment, with a move from outdated coal-fired power technology to renewables, firmed by gas. I would suggest that the public are not aware that there's a large cost associated with that, because our political class has said that there will be a reduction
Yeah.
in costs.
Yeah.
I think that's proven not to be the case.
Sure.
Other countries are moving towards nuclear power or increasing their nuclear power levels to deal with zero emissions technology. Are we on the right path?
Yeah. So I think the great tragedy of energy policy is that we had a moment 10 years ago, maybe even longer than 10 years ago, where it looked like there was a bit of a bipartisan consensus to put a market price on carbon and allow the market to
just decide
to have that transition in a smooth and sensible way that would have kept the costs at the right level. We didn't go down that path, partly because the Greens overreached and wanted a punitive carbon tax instead of market pricing, and then that set this very unproductive swing from one side to the other around energy policy. So as you say, we have not done it in the smoothest and best way possible, but there's still time to get it right, but it does involve being less ideological and actually being much more focused on pragmatic decisions about the energy mix. And I think we can probably learn a bit from China. China's putting on a lot of renewable capacity, but they're also building nuclear plants. They're also continuing to do coal and gas. You need all of that mix. Over time, you need to be shifting to cleaner and greener energy for a bunch of reasons, including the national sovereignty and those sorts of issues. So so there's good reasons for doing that. But I think there has been too much ideology and too much
totally agree.
Too much just muddled thinking. Again, this idea that that sort of decisions that Australia makes that are damaging for a particular community are saving the world when they actually don't move the dial
100%.
in terms of emissions. That doesn't make sense.
It doesn't.
But equally for people to say, I'm totally against all forms of renewables doesn't make sense. Because in many cases, and for a large part of the grid, actually solar in a place like Australia makes enormous sense.
I think rooftop solar has been one of the outstanding policies, that have come in.
And again, if you want to be glass half full, which is in keeping with the tenor of my book. We have gone from 0 to 40% renewables. As you say, we have got very high penetration of rooftop solar
in the world.
So,
in the world.
Despite the unedifying debates going on in Canberra, businesses and the population have sort of got on with things, and companies have made sensible investments. But we're approaching a difficult period now where we have to be careful that if we get those decisions wrong, we could see power outages, we could see massive increases in power, and as you say, there's a bit of an element of let 1,000 flowers bloom, to use the Chinese analogy.
Well, I think your point, and I think that it's a pertinent point, which is we shouldn't be restricting the energy mix.
Let's not be prescriptive about it.
Let's not be prescriptive.
Yeah.
We can say we want to go down a particular path on emissions reduction.
Yeah.
But why restrict the energy mix, right? And there's one school of thought, we'll never do nuclear energy. I'm not necessarily saying we should or shouldn't. I'm just saying that the public policy position is it's banned. It's too high cost. It'll never happen. Well, it's actually
and when so many other countries in the world are investing energy, to just say that there's no way you can even try that. There's no way that Amazon can turn up, create a data center somewhere, and power it from nuclear energy. Just seems dumb.
Well, and I question the idea that as Australians that we can't do it, but other countries can. Like us with our system of government, our outstanding regulatory systems, the fact that we already have nuclear power stations in Australia already for medical purposes. Really? Like it doesn't make sense.
No, Australian engineers are just as capable as engineers in Canada or the UK or France or the UAE or South Korea or anywhere else.
From a perspective of Australia as a country and the Australian success story, which of course is the glass half full nature of your book, I just find that a bizarre.
I've said in my book, you remember there's a chapter that sort of talks about Australians at our best as being sceptical pragmatists. We're sceptical. We're not sort of keen on ideologies and great sort of highfalutin national plans, and I think that's a strength. But we are also pragmatic, and when something is shown to work, we actually make it work. We're adaptable, and we're very good at that. And I think my view on energy would be, let's apply a bit of that sceptical pragmatism rather than being ideological, because being ideological in either direction has not served us well.
No, I agree. We'll have to end soon, so I'll use the opportunity to say, with your book and with your perspective, if you could just have three things out of your book, what would they be?
Yeah. So I think I had probably three objectives in my mind, actually, when I was writing the book. One was that in having lived a lot overseas, it was clear to me that while there's a lot of affection for Australia, there isn't actually a lot of understanding of what makes Australia different and how we are in some ways a bit like other countries, the UK, Hong Kong, Singapore, the US, but in lots of other ways we're not like that, and we actually do our political institutions differently. We do so my objective number one is for people in those places to have a better understanding of Australia beyond the kangaroos and the beaches. My second thing, which we've alluded to, is for Australians ourselves to understand what's made Australia work, and to make sure that we don't sort of throw away the recipe or become complacent and lose it. And then my third thing, I think, thinking about my kids' generation, my kids are in their early 20s, was, we do grow up in this kind of environment which is very negative and self-critical. And so I think it's good to remind our next generation of Australians that we may not get everything right, but actually over the long term, we've actually got quite a lot right.
Well, Andrew, I think your book is a very important and valuable contribution to the debate. I think it's really wonderful that you've taken the time to write it. There's so many more areas we could go into, but I just think it's great that you're doing it. I'm really thrilled you came on the podcast. The book is called Why We Should Be So Lucky.
No, we should be
We
so
should
lucky.
be so lucky. Let me try that again.
Why the Australian way
We should be
works.
so lucky. Why the Australian way works. I'm going to start. I've always wanted to say this, out in bookstores now.
It is.
Right?
It is.
There you go.
Amazon, Booktopia, or all good bookstores.
All good bookstores, right. So it's been a real pleasure. Andrew Lowe, thank you so
Terrific.
much for being part of the podcast.
Thanks very much, Jason.
Cheers, mate.
Cheers.